Hey everyone, this is Katie from Moonflower Moments. I'm back with part 2 of how I work with spirits of place. So in this video, I'm going to share how I work with the spirits of place that are within my garden, as well as the ones that are within my grove. So I do caretake like 9 trees on my property. It's a very small property, it's only a quarter of an acre, but that being said, the trees, they're my grove, they're my forest grove. And so this is part 2. I already did part 1 where I spoke specifically about how I work with fungi, dirt, plant, and animals. So this is just talking more about the broader themes of the garden and the trees, and less so much about particular specific entities that exist within my space. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and start with how I work with my garden. And so this is the kind of archetypal idea of the garden as well as the garden space. We have several different gardens that are in my yard. We nicknamed some of them based off of the decor we put in them. So I have, for example, a gnome garden because I have a little gnome village in it. I have a hedgehog garden because we have like a statue of a hedgehog in it. And I just find that to be really endearing to be able to work with them and give them their own names. But the first thing that I like to do at the start of every spring season is to pull out my Tarot of the Moon garden. I know I've spoken about this before, so I'm not going to be too lengthy here, but I like to use this deck to plan for spring and to plan for what the garden needs from me that year. So in the case of this year, the garden told me in specific that it needed me to focus on 7 of Cups and then the King of Pentacles. So I took that I would have like a little bit of confusion and lots of different ideas about where to go, where to start, what should come first. And so I stick in this space of the 7 of Cups, of just that beautiful area of being in deliberate brainstorming. And while I might have all of these ideas that are surrounding me, what's to come to the next part. And then I also have the King of Pentacles. So the King of Pentacles is reminding me to be a wise steward of my money, to not spend astronomical amounts on all of these different things, but instead to look at what I have already. Do I have plants that need to be divided that can go in empty spots of the yard? Do I have structures that I need to implement? So even though I said it's a wise steward of my money, I did put in garden edging just to make it a little bit tidier and cleaner, and thinking of the long-term investments that I can put into the yard based off of this. And so that is one thing that I like to do. I also like to periodically check in with my garden. So while the 7 of Cups and the King of Pentacles, the 7 of Cups being what I'm going into it with, the King of Pentacles being what it needs, that's what it is at the beginning of the year. This is a deck that I can use in the middle of summer to say, okay, how is it going? What are some things that you need from me? And I can either pull it from a thematic sense. So for example, the 9 of Pentacles, it wants more luxury. So maybe in the case, if I pull that 9 of Pentacles, I could create this nice little solitary area, a solitary sitting area. I do have a spot in my yard that I've been wanting to do that for a while. So I might focus on that solitary space. Or for example, I can look at the Emperor. And I'm seeing right here, these are meant to be ram's horns, but I might look at them and see, oh, those are snails. So I do have a bed that tends to attract snails. It seems like I need to take care of them because they are destroying the plants, as sad as that is. I tend to take like a no pesticide, no like interference kind of approach. I like to let the birds eat the snails and the lizards eat the snails, but maybe they've just gotten out of control, so I need to tend to them. But it's a good thing that I can see this from both a thematic perspective as well as a like physical perspective of what that garden space needs. And I just think it works well for that, right? Because it is, of course, Tarot of the Moon garden. So it's like, what is the dream that the garden wants me to know? You know, what are the underlying energies of this garden that I need to tend to in a very, very connected way. Okay, so similarly is a new deck that is in my collection, and that is the Cantigee Oracle. This is one of the newest decks that is in my collection, but I've been finding that this is also helping me check in with the thematic ideas of the garden. So for example, what the worms know, if I were to pull this, it would be perhaps that I need to tend to my compost bin, or perhaps I need to consult with the worms because they're here to teach me something. And I want to work with them because, I mean, what better creature knows the soil rather than the roots? And if my intention is to be grounded into the spirit of place to really nurture and caretake this home, of course, the worms are the correct creatures for me to do that with. But as of recent, the most recent one that I pulled was the pollination. So I really appreciate this one because I saw first off how whimsy these plants looked and how fragile they kind of looked. And then it made me wonder if the plant in the middle was the actual plant and all of these other plants were the memory of the plant that the bee had visited, right? Because we have this bee that's coming here into this plant. You can tell that this one is the one that's most sturdy. When this plant goes to visit this, when this bee goes to visit this plant, it's carrying all of the pollen from the other plants with it. And so it made me contemplate the journey of bees and what there is to learn about them and do some journaling in regards to that. But that does help me to stay grounded because shortly after engaging with that card, I walked outside and I noticed just how much clover was in bloom. Right now I have beautiful clover that is in bloom in my yard. And I sat and I watched the bees go from one clover to another clover. And it really did remind me of the importance of the work that we do within this space to foster something larger than ourselves. Because the bees do carry with them not only the pollen, but as well as the pesticides from plant to plant. And what is that doing overall? The herbicides from plant to plant. What is that doing overall to our ecosystem? So this deck, through its like very watery nature, your feet are two fish. I love this card so much because we do come from the fish. Because of its very watery nature, it reminds me to slow down and to contemplate the connections that are around me, the sentient nest. Beautiful. And the guidebook has like 6 pages per card, so it is definitely one to deep dive into. It's one of the decks that I consider to be an altar deck from now on because that's where it's going to stay. All right, next I'm going to bring out Under the Oak Tarot. So while this one might seem like a little bit too fantasy-esque for practical work in the yard, I do find it works really well. So when I first found out this deck was coming, I bought this deck because, one, I love jewel tones, but even if this deck had artwork that I didn't enjoy, I still would have bought it because it's under the oak. Most of my readings come underneath the oak trees that are in my yard. The oak trees are the 2 largest trees on my property. They're the ones that their roots literally run underneath the place where I'm reading right now, and so I'm deeply connected to them in every way. And I find that this deck, because it depicts another world, it really does reinforce my ideas about how the live oaks in my yard are hierophants in their own rights. So one of the first times that I ever pulled from this deck and then another deck, Naturescapes, I pulled for the same tree. His name is Sirocco. That is the live oak that's in my yard, or rather that's the name that I feel called to use when I'm referring to him. And I pulled Hierophant twice for him. And I feel like this deck, because it's right outside of my reach, it's right outside of my understanding, it's a little bit beyond me. Working with this deck in tandem with Sirocco, my live oak tree, helps me to see beyond what I would normally see. He is essentially the Hierophant, he is essentially the guide that is introducing me to not only new ideas about tarot, but new ideas about life. And I really enjoy that relationship that we have. I don't have to understand this tree by myself. I can reach out to that tree that's in my yard and say, for example, if I pull, this is the 5 of Pentacles. Well, in this particular case, it looks to me that the mice or the critters are making money. And so while that is not a typical depiction of the 5 of Pentacles, it could remind me of the years that my live oak tree has very few acorns versus the masting years where they pull literally thousands of acorns and they all fall in the yard and we have tiny little live oaks everywhere. And it's the concept of you won't always have that, but the concept of money goes in cycles. And I feel like when I understand like a unique point of view from a particular deck that is just a little bit different than a normal tarot point of view, and then I connect it with a tree that I know so intimately, it really builds my relationship not only with that tree, but with the deck itself. And so this deck is very cherished in my collection. It has like its specific role. It is something that we use. I use this deck for some other things too. I do find that this deck works well when I'm pulling cards for like Fantasyland. But for the most part, I really use it to work with Sirocco. All right. And then of course, because we are almost done with this one, I've shared this before on my channel, and this is my tree journal. Let me back up some. There we go. So unfortunately, this is a practice that I've set to the wayside, like in a formal capacity, though I'm still engaging with it in an informal capacity. But I used to pick a tree every month and pull cards from it and learn about the reference information of it. So I'm going to go specifically to the live oak, because Sirocco is a live oak. But I would sit and I would journal. I would learn about the tree. I would consider characteristics of it that I would write down that I would use with my work with that tree. So in the case of the live oaks in particular, they are very resilient because they have lateral taproots, very, very long lateral taproots. So they span massive areas. And that really does instate like kind of the heroic nature of the live oak itself. Go into the healing properties. And then I came up with like my own list of keywords with what it meant to me. And I did this for the loblolly, the live oak, water oak, which I love. I love water oak so much. I also did it for mulberry. And I actually love mulberry so much that I have a candle like right here titled mulberry. And when I want to tap into the youthful spirit of mulberry, I grab this. Cedar. Then I also have mimosa, which is funny. Here we go. Here's the mimosa leaves. I didn't have like access to a mimosa tree, so I was kind of like putting some things that just reminded me of mimosa, and then I got some last minute. And then also crepe myrtle, and this came from my granny's property. So it's especially special because she planted it like 40, 50, 60 years ago. So those are the ones that I studied in a formal capacity. And through that process, like I learned, for example, that the loblolly pine is one that is very like quick and sharp. So if you've ever looked at a loblolly pine, I'll post a picture of it now. Loblolly pines are known to grow really quickly, really fast. They are a lumber tree, and I have 4 of them in my yard. So they are the most prolific ones. I think that they have been the ones that were planted specifically. And so when I think about things that are reaching like tall heights, for a very like air-like purpose, which is the nature of the loblolly to me, I tend to pull out the Crow Tarot for it. And so what I do is, like I said, I contemplate the characteristics of these trees based off of what I know about them, and then I pick decks that just remind me of them. Sometimes it's very intuitive, and I will work with a deck with a tree for a little while before I realize exactly why I'm working with it. And then once I do like a particular spread, the connection will be made. But I never doubt myself. If I feel like a particular tree wants to communicate with me through a tarot, what it'll feel like to me is I'll sit down and I'll be contemplating a tree, and then all of a sudden I can't get a deck out of my mind. And it's like at that point I know that that's the deck that's meant to be paired with this tree. And so when I need to work with the pine trees that are in my yard, this is the deck that I pull. It's funny because my first reading I did for the right loblolly, which I'm looking at right now as we speak, I pulled these 2 cards for it. So I like that synchronicity. But it is also a card that, this is a deck of cards that reminds me of boundaries, because this is such a heavy swords deck, and loblollies are usually pounded on, planted on boundary markers. So the loblollies on my property, I have 3 in the back that mark my boundaries of the property lines, and then I have 1 in the front that just very like loudly announces like, hey, this is a property that has trees. And so I call it my Knight of Swords tree, because it is very like quick to say, hey, this is who we are. We nurture the trees here. But those 4 trees form the boundary of my yard as I know it. And so I like this deck because it does have that swords, like I'm going to cut, and if you don't respect that boundaries, that cut will come from there. The next one that I have to show, and this will be the last one, is for crepe myrtle. So I'll post a picture of that right now. And for crepe myrtle is very frou-frou, right? This is not a native plant. And so I wanted to get a deck that didn't feel like the US. I don't know exactly what country Boticelli is from. Maybe he is from the US. I will have to consult the internet after making this video to double check, but this doesn't feel like traditional American imagery, obviously. And when I think of crepe myrtle, what I usually think of is the fact that it is a beautiful non-native. That's one of the first things that comes to mind. So even though it's not something that is a language that I intuitively speak, that I natively speak, it's still a language that I find rich and gorgeous, in the sense of like the tree being that language and the deck being that language as well. This deck, I have to work a little bit harder for it because it's not so practical. It's a little bit more like uppity to me, kind of like the crepe myrtle is. It's not like down home, like gritty Southern culture. And so like I have to sit down and think and like kind of see through the layers, kind of like you would with a culture that is not yours, to be able to engage in it. And I don't know, I hope that makes sense. But really also too, the crepe myrtle has like beautiful tiny little flowers. And so this deck has tiny little flowers galore that I like to use to work with it. I don't know, I like it. So those are some of the ways that I work within the larger scheme of my garden, as well as the larger scheme of my grove. If you're interested in this kind of content, I'm going to go ahead and leave a link in the description box below to this playlist. And I have another video shortly following this, which is going to be titled How I Work with it within the Spirits of Place within Human Structures, which would be my home, the actual home that I live in, and then the culture that I belong. So this was Kate from Moonflower Moments. I appreciate y'all so much for being here, and until next time, I'll see y'all later.